I would like to welcome Dr. George Pollack. He is a full professor at the University of Texas, and he has been working in the field of neuroscience for over 40 years now. He is a very well-regarded, very esteemed scientist, and we are very lucky to have him today. During his career, he has won numerous awards from many different sources. Some of them have been NIH awards. He has been the chair of NIH Study Section. That is the place that gives out most of the grants for these types of experiments. And he's been in charge of the committees that actually hand out the grants to various different ones. So he's a well-regarded scientist throughout the world. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Pollack, and we'll get started with the lecture.
Well, thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be here. My colleagues and I, John Brugge and Brett Schofield, have been having a wonderful, wonderful time here in Iowa with the neuroscience group here. So what I'd like to do this evening is tell you about some personal thoughts that I have about the mind and the brain. And this really started several years ago. I'm a guest lecturer every year in an honors philosophy course, and Mark Sansbury, who runs the course, asked me, would you talk about basically the brain and how the brain might relate to the mind? And I thought about this for a moment, and I said, let me tell you how I thought about this, but beginning way, way back when I was just a college student. In fact, I never really explicitly thought about it. I did it implicitly somehow. And the thoughts that I had weren't really based upon any great philosophical ideas that I had read about, although many great philosophers have thought about this and written extensively about it. But rather these ideas that I'm going to tell you about, at least in the initial part of the talk, are really my own. They're from an untutored novice. And then I'm going to tell you more about and try and support some notions that I'm going to tell you about by explaining to you somewhat about how the brain actually works. And it's really quite fascinating. But the basic idea was that I had always in my life thought about myself in a sort of a duality, if you will. And the duality is this, that there were two things going on. The first was me, right here. Here I am, right here, with a bunch of friends of mine at a meeting. And for me, what I was is something inside of me expressed my essence and my morality and my values and my personality. It was me, just like it is now. And that me, I'll refer to that me as my soul, didn't have an organic basis. It didn't reside anywhere. It just was here. It was me. It was part of me. It had no organic basis. I was born with it, and I would die with it. It was just an integral, and everyone I knew had it. I recall going back to my 40th high school reunion, and I met all the guys I used to know, and they were all the same. It immediately came back to me. That's why I like this one. That's why I like that one. They, too, had their own essence, if you will, their own being, their own souls. And everyone I knew or have known has been like that. And then there was this, everybody knows you got a brain up here. But what was my brain? My brain was, for me, and basically almost still is to a certain extent, a machine. It registers all of the energies, the light and the sound, and the smells out there, and presents it to me in an unfiltered way such that I can really perceive reality as it exists. And it enables me to speak, and it enables me to move. In short, it's like a machine, and sort of nothing more than that. A very complex machine, an intricate machine at that, but not my soul. It was just a machine. So the point I really wish to make is that the whole thinking that I had was that my actions were really a reflection of me, of my soul, but that was overtly expressed by my brain. And they were two different things. One was a sort of an essence, I don't know where it was, but it had no organic being, that was me, and the other had an organic being, and it expressed all of my being, that is my brain. And I suspect a lot of people feel that way, if not most people. We all read the Bible, and we're all products of, most of us, of a Judeo-Christian society. And, the Bible tells us we were created in God's image, and we have some of his essence. And indeed, you can even see that enshrined in the Sistine Chapel, where God is giving life to man, right? And whether you're religious or not, you have an essence. If you're religious, you, of course, believe you derive it from God. If you're not, it comes from someplace else. But regardless of where it comes from, we all sort of believe that in some way or another. At least I know I did. And then I became a neuroscientist. I studied all about the brain, and I have another duality, if you will, because intellectually I learned that that's simply not true. Emotionally, I still feel it is, but intellectually, I know it's not. And intellectually, what I learned is that my reality, that my existence, everything that I am, that I feel, is really nothing more than the operations of the brain, the computations that this organ that we keep inside of our skulls makes for us. And it is composed of billions, tens of billions, maybe hundreds of billions of individual nerve cells that make trillions of connections. And it's the interactions among all of these connections and all of these neurons that make me, me, and that make you, you. And I would like to now support that assertion. And the way I'm going to support this assertion that a reality is nothing more than that which the brain constructs for us, I'm going to do it by illustrating three things. And the first is having to do with our perceptions. And I want to explain to you that our eyes and the brain construct color. And I'll explain in a moment why that is, to me at least, and when I learned about it, a rather remarkable thing. And the second is even more remarkable. I'm going to tell you about people who suffer strokes. They suffer strokes to a particular part of the brain, the right part up here in the parietal lobe. And what happens to them is the most extraordinary thing you can almost begin to imagine. They lose all awareness of left. Left ceases to exist for them, and that includes the left part of their bodies. Right? And I will show you and read you some case histories, and I promise you it will surprise you. And then the third I want to get to is perhaps the most important. This has to do with the idea that, if you will, your soul, your essence, your values, your morality, all of what you in essence are and think of yourself resides up here. And I'm going to illustrate that to you by an iconic case in neuroscience, the case of a man by the name of Phineas Gage. And the injury to his brain caused those who knew him to say his mind was so radically changed that he was no longer Gage. He, in essence, had lost his entire personality, being, morality, if you will, his soul. So let me start now with the idea of color vision. And the reason I do this is because when I look out into the world, I think I see the world as it is. I think that's the world, and it's just put into my brain, if you will, unfiltered. That's the reality. Everything that exists out there is I see, right? But actually what I've learned is that that's not true, that what we see out there and our reality is nothing more than our sensory receptors tell us about the various energies in the world. That is what our sensory receptors tell us about light and sound and chemicals in the air, etc. That's a limitation, and a very severe one. But that's not enough. And not only do our sensory receptors in our eye or ear have to tell us what the energies are that impinge upon our bodies, but our brain has to construct a perception of those things. That is the raw material. Our brain then has to work on it. And how we perceive the world, and everything in it, is limited by the information provided by our sensory receptors, and then by the particular computations that our brains perform on that information. I want to illustrate that, again, with color vision. Right? I look at colors. I think I see all the colors of the rainbow. And I don't. Well, I do, but I don't. And here's what I mean. I have to tell you, first of all, a little bit about the eye. And this is from a textbook in neuroscience about here's the eye right here, and this is the back of the eye. And in the back of the eye right here are these things, these photoreceptors called rods and cones. And I really only want to talk about the cones, but both of them contain a chemical called a photopigment, if you will. And what happens is that photopigment will capture light, and it will capture certain wavelengths or colors of light. And when it does that, it then, through a series of processes, it converts that energy that it captured into the language of the nervous system, which is a change in the electrical state of these cells. Right? And these three cells are the kinds that are important, these kinds of photoreceptors, because they are the ones that capture the energy. And they, in turn, then will connect with these other cells in your eye. These are actual nerve cells or neurons. And there's a little bit of processing, and more than a little bit, there's some processing that goes on. And ultimately, what the result of that processing is transmitted to the brain via the optic nerve that runs on the base of your brain and then goes to your brain is for it being interpreted. And there are three kinds of wavelengths that are sensitive, that these cones are sensitive to. And I'm going to describe the cones by the nature or the wavelengths that they're sensitive to. And these are the short wavelengths, or blue cones. And these are the middle wavelengths, or green cones. And these are the long wavelengths, or red cones. Right? And each cone type is most sensitive, shown by the peak here, to a particular wavelength of light. The blue cones to this 420 nanometers, the green cones to 530 nanometers, and the red cones to 560 nanometers. Right? Okay. Now, one would normally assume, I know I would have, that the way you see color is that the light reflected from a certain object, like her pants might be a certain wavelength. Let's say it's red, and it would stimulate mainly the red cones. And when the red cones are stimulated, they inform the neurons in the retina, and they then transmit that information, and you see red. It's not that simple. It works far more complicated than that. And the idea is then that color is the result not of the stimulation of the cell or the amount, but rather a comparison of the unequal stimulation of the three types of cones. And it's constructed, that is, color is constructed in the brain by both a process of addition of some wavelengths, that is, the addition from the process or the output of three types of cones, and the subtraction of others. And it's the subtraction I want to focus on. And it's the subtraction process is that green and red cancel each other. They subtract from each other. And blue and yellow also cancel each other or subtract from each other. And there is no law in physics that said that should be so. That is so because of neural processing. And let me illustrate that for you. I'm going to illustrate it with a color wheel. This represents all the hues that you're capable of seeing. Right? And there are two kinds of hues that I want to point out. There's the unitary hues, the pure red, the pure yellow, the pure green, and the pure blue. And there are the binary hues. The binary hues mean that you can mix a certain amount of red and a certain amount of yellow, and you start to get various kinds of oranges until you end up here with pure yellow. And then if you mix yellow and green, you end up then ultimately with pure green, and you can mix the green with some blue and add turquoises of various sorts until you end up with blue, and then you mix the blue with the red, and you got the picture, all right? So there are additions of reds and yellows and greens and blues, but there is no such thing as a mixture of red and green. You never see a reddish green in your color experience. It doesn't exist. Nor do you ever see a bluish yellow or a yellowish blue. They don't exist because they cancel each other. And they cancel each other because that's the way your retina is made. And I'm going to show that to you. All right? 3 cones again, and they're going to connect here with these nerve cells. These are the nerve cells they're going to connect with. And here's the way they make a connection. The green cones will cause these neurons to become excited, right? And then that's the yin of the nervous system. And then they'll receive inputs, connections from the red cones, which will have the yang of the nervous system, will cause the neuron to be suppressed or inhibited, right? And that's the idea. These two cancel each other in the nervous system, and the exact opposite occurs too. The reds can excite some neurons and inhibit, the greens inhibit others, right? And now comes a very interesting thing, because there are no yellow cones. They don't exist. The nervous system has to make yellow neurons. And the way they make yellow neurons, I don't mean neurons that look yellow, I mean neurons that are most sensitive to yellow, is they take the output from the green cones and the red, and they add them. And then they take the output from the blue cones and they subtract them. So the idea is that the nervous system is taking red and subtracting it from green, or green and subtracting it from red. It's making yellow and subtracting it from blue, or taking blue and subtracting it from yellow. It's the operation of the nervous system. That's the way it's made, right? That's why you have a cancellation of red and green and blue and yellow. I'm going to show it to you, right? So let's take this illustration. This is what visual psychophysicists do all the time. This is a very compelling illustration. What they're going to do is they're going to take 2 monochromatic lights. This one at 540 nanometers and this one at 670 nanometers. These are very carefully selected because this one is greenish yellow, right? And this one is yellowish red. But this one, the amount of green this one contains is equal to the amount of red that this contains. So as a consequence of the green canceling the red, you're left with yellow. And you know what you see when these 2 monochromatic lights are shown simultaneously on a screen? That's what you see. You see pure yellow, 580 nanometers, because the green cancels the red and the red cancels the green. And you can play all kinds of games like this, and it really, really, really works. And it's sort of illustrated here on this color diagram. This would be a colored wheel. This is the pure red, and you add small amounts of yellow, and here you're adding, at this particular point right here, this is the yellowish red. You have this amount of red, this amount of yellow, and this one is the greenish yellow here, this amount of green, the green and the red, they're exactly the same, they cancel. That's why you see the yellow, all right? So I just wanted to get this idea across to you that the only thing you can see are the things that the wavelengths that your sensory receptors are sensitive to, that allow you to see. And then the way the colors that you see are a consequence of the way the nervous system constructs color in the retina. And then you might say, and this becomes really spooky, what happens if you had different kinds of receptors or had a different kind of neural system? You would see different colors. And it exists in the world. It exists all around us. And the way I want to illustrate this is with birds. All right? So this happens to be a really pretty bird. This is a bunting. All right? Well, I mean, look at the colors on that bird. All right? And this, if you take an instrument that can measure the wavelengths, the spectrum, if you will, of the bird, this is what it's like. It's got some particular energy here in the near ultraviolet, which we don't see because our photoreceptors are not sensitive to it. And it's got that energy way out here as well, you know, in the greens and blues and yellows, right? And you would see it like this. Turns out, another bunting wouldn't see it that way because the other bunting has a fourth kind of photopigment and cone, one that's sensitive to the near ultraviolets. And as a consequence of that, and the consequence of the way in which these particular wavelengths are handled by the nervous system, comparative visual physiologists have shown that these birds see these colors. Now, let me explain this. This triangle right here, that represents all of the colors that we can see. The blues, the reds, the yellows, the greens, whites, so forth. All right? This represents the additional colors that the bird can see because of his ability to have a fourth kind of photoreceptor. And you say, gee, what are those colors? And the answer is, I don't know, and you don't know, because they have never, ever entered into your conscious experience. I have no idea what they're like, right? But they're there, and the bird sees them, and nature is full of examples like this. The point is that you see out there, just like I'm looking at you right now, this is reality, man. It's all out there. It's not. It's only that part that our photoreceptors are able to absorb and that our nervous system is able to construct that we see. Now, I want to make the second point. All right? So in other words, the real point of this was that color is not really necessarily a property of light. It's a construct of your nervous system, right? And that construct is due to the properties and the initial processing, the properties of your cones, their ability to absorb light, the processing here, but it's not enough. It's necessary but not sufficient, because you've also got to have the right stuff up here in your cortex. In other words, this brain up here is not just a platform, a passive platform that the signals which the retina receives just transmits up, sort of like a camera does to a television set. No, no, no. It takes that raw material that the eye presents to it, and it processes it to create color, right? Color, the color that you see. Now, I want to illustrate this to you with the case of the colorblind painter. This is an essay in a book called Anthropologist on Mars by Oliver Sacks. Many of you may have heard of Oliver Sacks. He is a very famous neurologist who writes these books about his patients for the lay public. And this is a particularly interesting one I'd like to tell you a little bit about. This is the story of a man, I forget his, Mr. I think he called him. And the idea was this, not the idea, this was supposedly a real patient. Mr. I woke up one morning, and previous night he had suffered a stroke. And the only way he knew he had suffered a stroke was that he couldn't see color. Mr. I was a painter, not a house painter. He was an artist. He was really plugged into the art scene in New York. He was a serious artist, and he lost his ability to see color. And he called in Sacks. They even brought some very famous visual physiologists like Samoseki, and even Francis Crick came along, who was an interest in these kinds of things in those days. They examined his eyes. There was nothing wrong with his retina, right? It was apparently up here. And there was nothing they could do for him. But they followed him. Sacks followed him for 2 years. And he became horribly depressed. I mean, horribly depressed. He almost committed suicide. He would then haunt diners at night because he just would eat food that was black and white. Everything became ratty to him, as he described it. Nothing was pure anymore. He didn't want to see colors. He didn't want to see food. Food in particular just... He had difficulty. He couldn't eat ketchup because the ketchup wasn't red, it was black to him. Things just weren't right. And then one morning he came home, and he had an epiphany. And the epiphany was that he saw a sunrise. And he said it was the most spectacular thing he's ever seen because he saw it in these heightened sense of contrast, of grays and blacks and whites and brilliances. No color, but brilliant contrasts. And he had this epiphany then basically started his healing process. And he adapted to his world, began painting again, and became very happy. But he only painted, of course, in black and white, no in color. And here's the moral of the story, that about 3 years after his injury, I'm showing it to you here, I'm just going to read it to you, we suggested to Mr. I that he try to regain his color vision. Since the mechanisms for comparing wavelengths in his retina were intact, and only a part of the cortex was damaged, we thought it might be possible, at least in theory, to retrain another part of the brain to perform the requisite functions and thus achieve some restoration of color vision. What was striking was Mr. I's response to this suggestion. In the first months after his injury, he said he would have embraced such a suggestion, done everything possible to be cured. But now that he conceived the world in different terms, and again found it coherent and complete, he thought the suggestion unintelligible, and I underline this, and repugnant. Repugnance. Now that color had lost its former associations, its sense, he could no longer imagine what its restoration would be like. Its reintroduction would be grossly confusing, he thought, might force a welter of irrelevant sensations upon him and disrupt the now reestablished visual order of his world. He had been for a while in a sort of a limbo. Now he had enthusiastically embraced, neurologically and psychologically, a world without color. And I might add that they had a postscript that he felt the world he was seeing now was just as beautiful, no, he even said more beautiful than the world he had imagined before, the world with color. And you and I can't imagine this. And the reason we can't imagine it is because it's never entered into our conscious experience. We are blinded by color. And we could never imagine his world. Now, I want you to think about this because it's a really interesting story. It captures your imagination. But you think about this for a moment. This is incredibly profound. And it's profound for two reasons. The first is it tells you something about the cortex. Right? And what it says to you is, he could see, I didn't read this part to you, I should have. His vision was perfect. His acuity, he said, I have the sight of an eagle, I can read a license plate 2 blocks away. He could see motion, motion, form, you name it. He just couldn't see color. That means that up here, these things, color, form, motion, etc., they're all represented separately. But I see this as a totality. I look at you, I don't see you as color being separated. It's an integral part of you, just like a daffodil is yellow or a car is red. No. It's not a totality up here. It's not a unified representation. It's a distributed representation. And by distributed, what I mean is that it's there in different parts of the cortex. In other words, this isn't the only example. There's a classic example of a woman in Munich who suffered a small stroke where she can't see things move. She can see color, form, everything. She cannot see things move, and it is a horrible experience. There are classic examples of people who suffer strokes in other places, and you know what they can't see? Faces. Faces. What do you mean you can't see a face? You talk to these people, it's most interesting. They say, yeah, I see the face, but I can't recognize it. It's not a face to me. It's just something there. Right? They can't recognize their own face. They can't recognize their children or their spouse. They can't recognize anyone. And you ask them about it. Yeah, it's a face, but it's not anybody's face. I don't know what this is like. I thought a face is just another part of the visual scene. No. It's special, and there's a big part of the cortex devoted to it. So in other words, when I look out into the scene, what happened is the retina has to present all of this to my brain. My brain then takes it and parcels it out to different places. Color, motion, faces, other attributes. And then somehow we see it all bound together as a unity. I don't know how this works. I really don't. But it's absolutely to me at least, just a miracle. And it offers then one of the great challenges to modern science to figure out how it is that all this works. But I want to continue, all right? And I want to continue now with the idea that fine, we have sensory perceptions, we have retinas, we have things that absorb energy that present it to the brain, and the brain somehow processes it, represents it. Great. But we have to be aware of it also. And now I want to tell you about the whole idea that the brain, this thing up here, creates your entire awareness of space. And I want to illustrate it to you with a condition suffered by people who suffer strokes or damage to this part of the brain on the right side, the right parietal lobe, actually this side, not the left, the right. Right? And what happens is they display an absolutely remarkable syndrome called neglect, and if the neglect is really severe, they also have a denial, right? Called neglect with denial. Right? And you're not going to believe this, but it's true. Right? When this happens, they lose all sense of things on the left. This part of the world, of the entire world, ceases to exist for them. And you say, well, they can't see it. No, they can see it. It just doesn't exist. It goes away, right? And the classic symptoms of a person like this is you take them and you ask them to draw a house, okay? You say, there's the house, you draw it. And they draw this. Right? And you say to them, here's a face, draw the face. They draw half the face. Here's a cross, copy it. This is the cross. And when the doctor asks them, how does it look to you? They look at it and they say, looks good to me. They say, is it complete? Yeah, it's fine. It's what you asked me to draw. I drew this. There it is. They can't see it. They really can't see it. This is an example of an artist and his self-portrait who suffered such a stroke. Some people recover, not all of them, but some recover. And this is his own self-portraits during his period of recovery. 2 months, 5 months. I mean, you can just see the progress that he made during the healing process over this 9-month period. All right? Now, to give you a feel for this, I got to read this to you. This is an essay, again, by Oliver Sacks. Oliver Sacks has written many, many books. This is a wonderful book. You ever want to get a book and read it, I urge you to get this one. It's called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. All right? It's you can buy it in paperback. Each of the essays in here is only like 2 pages. They're really short, but he writes so beautifully. I got to read you this essay. This is about a woman who had suffered a stroke to her right parietal lobe. All right? And her name is Mrs. I. All right? So, Mrs. I sometimes complains to the nurse that they have not put her dessert or coffee on a tray. Yeah. And when she said, but Mrs. S, it's right there on the left, she seems not to understand what they say and does not look to the left. If her head is gently turned so the dessert comes into sight in the preserved right half of the visual field, she says, oh, there it is. It wasn't there before. She has totally lost the idea of left with regard to both the world and her own body. Sometimes she complains that her portions are too small, but this is because she only eats from the right half of the plate. It does not occur to her that it has a left half as well. Sometimes she will put on lipstick and make up the right half of her face, leaving the left half completely neglected. It's almost impossible to treat these things because her attention cannot be drawn to them. And she has no conception that they're wrong. Right? She knows it intellectually and can understand and laugh, but it is impossible for her to know it directly. So knowing it intellectually, knowing it inferentially, she has worked out strategies for dealing with her imperception. She cannot look left directly. She cannot turn left. So what she does is turn right, and turn right through a circle. Thus she requested and was given a rotating wheelchair, and now if she cannot find something which she knows should be there, she swivels to the right through a circle until it comes into view. She finds this successful if she cannot find her coffee or dessert. If her portions seem too small, she will swivel to the right, keeping her eyes to the right, until the previously missed half nut comes into view. She will eat this, or rather half of this, and feel less hungry than before. But if she still is hungry, or if she thinks on the matter and realizes that she may have perceived only half of the missing half, she will take a second rotation until the remaining quarter comes into view and in turn bisect it again. This usually suffices. After all, now she's eaten 7/8 of her portion, but she may, if she is feeling particularly hungry or obsessive, make a third turn and secure another 1/16 of her portion, leaving, of course, the remaining 1/16, the left 1/16, on her plate. It's absurd, she says. I feel like Zeno's arrow. I never get there. It may look funny, but under the circumstances, what else can I do? It would seem far simpler for her to rotate the plate than rotate herself. She agrees, and has tried this, or at least tried to try. But it's oddly difficult. It does not come naturally, whereas whizzing around in her chair does, because her looking, her attention, her spontaneous movements and impulses are now exclusively and instinctively on the right. Especially distressing to her is the derision that greeted her when she appeared only half made up, the left side of her face absurdly void of lipstick and rouge. I look in the mirror, she said, and I do all that I see. Would it be possible, we wondered, for her to have a mirror such that she would see the left side of her face on the right? That is, as someone else facing her would see her. We tried a video system with a camera and monitor facing her, and the results were startling and bizarre. For now, using the video screen as a mirror, she did see the left side of her face to her right, an experience doubly confounding, uncanny for her, because the left side of her face and body, which she now saw, had no feeling, no existence for her as a consequence of her stroke. Take it away, she cried in distress and bewilderment, so we did not explore the matter further. This is a pity, because there might have been promise in such forms of video feedback. It's fair to say that the matter is physically, indeed metaphysically, confusing. So, wow, what do you say about something like that? I mean, it's hard to believe. Well, I want to give you even a better feel for this. So this is this author. Her name is Lisa Genova. Lisa Genova received her PhD in neurobiology from Harvard. And instead of going into research or academics, what she did was she decided to research clinical syndromes and write a novel about them. And her first novel was Still Alice, about Alzheimer's disease, and it became a bestseller. And her second is Left Neglected. And this takes you right into the world of people who have suffered this syndrome. And I'd just like to read you one portion of her book. And it's by... And this is just one portion of one chapter. It's an episode very similar to Mrs. S's. Was it Miss S? Yeah, that I just read to you. And here it is. It's about Sarah, who is the main character in the story. And I'm going to read to you. It's right up here. And has sustained damage to her right parietal lobe from a car accident. She is just finishing lunch in her hospital room with her neurologist, Dr. Kwan, who comes in, and this is the dialogue. "How was your lunch?" Dr. Kwan asks. "Good. Did you eat everything, What if I told you there was a chocolate bar on your plate?" he asked, smiling. I've got to hand him for trying. Chocolate is definitely the right bait to use with me, but I don't need an incentive. I'm highly motivated. It's not that I'm trying not to see what he sees. I tell him, I don't see it. Well, maybe I can feel it. I wipe the clean white plate with the palm of my hand. There's nothing there, not one kernel of rice, not one morsel of chocolate. And Dr. Kwan suggests, well, try turning your head to the left. And I stare at the plate. And I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to get to where you're asking me to go. It's not a place I can turn or look at. It's like if you told me to turn and look at the middle of my back. I believe the middle of my back exists, but I have no idea how to see it. Intellectually, I understand there's a left side to the plate, but it's not a part of my reality. I can't look at the left side of the plate because it's not there. There is no left side. I feel like I'm looking at the whole plate. I know it's frustrating. I can't describe it. I think you just did, the doctor replies. But, she asks, is there really chocolate there? Yup, the doctor replies, the kind Bob, her husband, brought yesterday. Without understanding how this might work, I grabbed the top of the plate and rotated it to the bottom. Ta-da! Almond Butter Crunch, my favorite. That's cheating, says Dr. Kwan. Totally fair, I say, chewing Sublime mouthful. Okay, but answer this. Where did the chocolate come from? I know what he wants me to say. He wants me to say the left. But there is no left. Heaven, I say. Sarah, think about it. It came from the left side of your plate, which is now on the right, and the right, which you just saw, so you know it exists. It's on the left. He might have just said something about pi times the square root of infinity. I don't care where the right side of the plate went. I'm eating my favorite chocolate and enjoying it. All right, you get the picture? I don't know how to cope with this. I mean, when I tell my students about this, they don't just know how to. They don't know how to get their head around it. They keep thinking, no, it's her vision. She can't see it. No. It's not her vision. It's what she said. There is no left. I don't know how to go to some place that is not in my existence. It's amazing. I don't know what else to say. Right? And that's it. Okay. Before I go on, I want to tell you one other thing. This is not just of clinical or intellectual interest. There are two very famous people who many of you have heard of and are familiar with who suffered such strokes. And one of them was Woodrow Wilson. And Wilson suffered really a number of strokes, dating back to when he was still at Princeton before he became president. But a few weeks after the Treaty of Versailles, he suffered a bad stroke. And that stroke paralyzed his left side. He denied it. No, that's what people often do who have neglect. They deny it. Say, is there anything wrong? Nope. Can't move your arm. I can move my arm. Move it. Whoop, I just did. Nope. They absolutely deny it's wrong. It's absolutely amazing. And Wilson did also. And his Secretary of State brought it up at a cabinet meeting because he became very concerned, and Wilson fired him. And in the denial and in the difficulties that he had, he just assumed he was going to be president, but of course his wife largely took over, and she ran the government until the next election. And of course he could not argue effectively to the Congress to enter into the League of Nations. And I don't know if this changed the course of history. I'm sure it did to a certain extent. Another very prominent person was the Supreme Court Justice, William O. Douglas, who also denied he had suffered this stroke, and his colleagues made him resign. It took them a year, but he was on the bench with this symptom for a year before he resigned. Anyway, I'd like to now just sort of bring this to a full circle, because I've told you about this whole idea of your brain creating your sensory perceptions and your reality of the world. And then I told you that the brain also creates your awareness of the world. But, even though they've lost the awareness and even though they've lost ability to see, these people were basically still the same people. They had a deficit for sure, but they weren't fundamentally, if you will, to use the word I used before, their soul wasn't changed. And now I want to show you a case of an illustration of a man whose soul was changed due to a massive neurological insult. And his name is Phineas Gage. And let me explain to you something about Mr. Gage. All right. This is a picture of him. And what happened was, and for reasons I'll explain to you in a moment, this rod, he was working, he was tamping down something, the rod exploded, and it went through his eye, out his skull, and landed 50 yards away. This is a reenactment of the insult that he suffered. Here is the rod going through his eye, going through his brain, damaging his frontal lobes. In fact, his prefrontal areas. Right? And here is the whole story of Phineas Gage, and the reason that he became an icon in neuroscience. There are always landmark events in all of human endeavor, and one of the landmark events is our appreciation of the human cortex was the case of Phineas Gage. The case resulted from a bizarre accident that occurred in the afternoon of September 13th, 1848 in Vermont. A gang of men under the direction of their energetic and likable foreman, 25-year-old Phineas B. Gage, was working on the new line of the Rutland and Burlington Railroad. They were about to blast rock that blocked their way, and Phineas himself took charge of the delicate business of pouring gunpowder into a deep, narrow hole drilled in a large stone. With the powder in place, he rammed a long iron rod to tamp down the charge before covering it with sand. But the tamping iron rubbed against the side of the shaft, and a spark ignited the powder. The massive rod, 3.5 feet long and 1.25 inches in diameter, weighing 13 pounds, shot from the hole into the force of the explosion. The missile struck Phineas just beneath his eye, and in a fraction of a second tore through his skull, departed from a hole in the top of his head, and finally landed 50 yards away. But that was not the end of Phineas P. Gage, at least not the end of the body that bore his name. He was thrown to the ground, and his hands and feet twitched convulsively. But within a few minutes, he was conscious again and able to speak. The other workmen carried him to an ox cart and rode for almost a mile, sitting upright, to a hotel in town. With little assistance, he stepped from the cart, climbed a flight of stairs to a room where his wounds were dressed while he waited for the arrival of the local physician. The two doctors could hardly believe the incredible tale until they examined the wounds themselves. The next few days were difficult. The wound became infected, and Phineas was delirious. But his condition improved, and after 3 weeks he was eager to get up and about. By the middle of November, he was wandering about the town planning his new future. And here is the point to this unusual tale. Phineas Gage had a new future because he was a different man. The efficient and capable foreman no longer existed. The friendly, considerate Phineas Gage was dead, and in his place rose a childlike phoenix with the strength of an ox and the temper to match. Years later, John Harlow, one of the two doctors who had originally tended Gage, wrote, "His physical health is good, and I am inclined to say that he has recovered. The equilibrium or balance, so to speak, between his intellectual facilities and animal propensities seemed to have been destroyed. He is fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, which was not previously his custom, manifesting but little deference for his fellows, impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desires, at times completely obstinate, yet capricious and vacillating, devising plans for future operations which are no sooner arranged than they are abandoned. In this regard, his mind was radically changed, so decidedly that his friends and acquaintances said that he was, quote, no longer Gage. The new Phineas Gage was rejected by his employers, and he drifted around the country, exhibiting himself in the tamping iron that had twisted his mind at carnivals and fairs. He died in San Francisco, but his skull and the iron rod are still on display in the museum of the Harvard Medical School. All right? So, it's that statement. In this regard, his mind, if you will, was so radically changed, so decidedly, that his friends and acquaintances said he was no longer Gage. So to me, at least, what this said is that the injury that he sustained to his frontal lobe so transformed him that, in my judgment, Phineas Gage had lost his soul. And the reason he had lost his soul, at least the reason that we think that it happened, was that this rod that went through his forehead, the front of his brain, if you will, his frontal lobe, severed connections between that part of the frontal lobe, which is used for planning and various other things, and the emotional parts of his brain, those that control those primal things that always roil inside of us: anger, aggression, sex, appetite, things of this sort. Right? If you will, the reptilian brain that's communicating now with his frontal lobes. And these connections were severed, and thus the normal, if you will, inhibitions and restraints on these primal instincts were lost. And it was that reason that he changed so dramatically. So anyway, what I hope I wish to do here is just take you for a brief tour of the brain and try to explain to you some of the things that I have always found. It's difficult to search for a word that adequately describes it, to say they're remarkable, absolutely almost mind-boggling. How this thing up here works, how it endows you with so many of what you are, and how its operation, in my judgment at least, basically makes you you. It endows you with everything you are. And it distinguishes you from me, because your brain makes you you, and my brain makes me me. Indeed, what I tell my students is, unlike something like a heart or a kidney or a lung, which can be transplanted from one person to another, you can't transplant a brain. No, no, no. And even if you could, even by some miracle, if you could, you wouldn't be you anymore. You'd be somebody else. Right? It is you. And I would just leave you with the thought that this is, and is generally considered to be, the most complex piece of matter known in the universe that's contained in here. And our understanding of how this complex piece of matter works to endow you with all the things that it endows you with is, to my judgment at least, one of the great scientific enterprises that we are privileged to be engaged in. So I thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you. Anyone like to ask any questions? I'm not sure. Well, some of the easy ones, for example, are hard. Yeah, but for example, the whole idea of how one acquires knowledge and the reality of knowledge. I mean, this idea of sensory perception relates directly to that issue, and it's not easy, but it doesn't relate to these issues really of this one. Is this really your soul? That becomes a really toughie.
But what makes red red?
The eternal question.
Yeah.
And the other question is, do you see the same red that I do?
No, we don't.
I mean, you can test these things, and we know why they work and what the algorithms are. The color vision is especially difficult and not terribly well understood, not the full extent of color vision. So I don't, the answer to your question is, how do you see red? I don't think it's fully understood.
Do you know if there are any areas of the brain that are especially interesting for the problem of consciousness, like the thalamus maybe?
Well, let me answer that two ways. And my colleagues can correct me if they would like. I have no idea what consciousness is. I can recognize it. I don't exactly know how to define it. And I don't think anyone has any idea how it's produced. I've heard some of the great sort of philosopher neuroscientists say that is perhaps one of the two most important questions in all of science, the other being, what is the origin of life? But I don't have an answer for it. The next question, or the answer to your next question is, I don't think there is such a thing as an uninteresting part of the brain. They're all incredibly complicated, interesting. Some may be more so than others, but they're all interesting. So I don't know how to answer it other than that.
Thank you.
You mentioned about patients who neglect the left, but what if you make them turn their head to the left? Like, you turn their head to the left, would they something snap in their brain and make them realize that there's a left?
I'm not a clinical neurologist, right? But I can tell you everything that I've seen and everything that I've read. And the best description was that of Lisa Genova. You tell the person, move your head to the left. And they don't know how to do it. That doesn't exist for them. Now, what you can do is you can turn their head. Or other things they can do is often they can give them help by starting with a pointer, for example, in the right part and moving it and tell them to, and then they'll follow it. And then they see it. Yeah, then they see it. But it's I don't know what to say. It's absolutely stunning. What do you say? What do you mean? It left is it does it's right there. I don't know how else to do. I'm as stunned as you are. Right? I have a lot of trouble getting my head around this. That is coming to grips with it and really understanding it. Not a matter of being able to remember it, but really having a feel for it, because I've never experienced it. I don't know. None of us have. And that's the idea.
Thank you.
What research has been done connecting the various kinds of mental illness with the various parts of the brain?
Oh, you're asking probably the wrong person here for
Okay.
that, because I'm not a clinical neurologist.
Okay.
But I can tell you what I know with the human depressive illnesses or degenerative illnesses. Oh, there's an enormous amount going on, and it's really, really, really hard. Particularly things like Alzheimer's. They don't understand very much about it. I just heard a seminar on it the other day. And it's in ways distressing how difficult the issue is, and how disappointing all of the previous and very recent hopes for treatments are. But there's a lot of people interested in this. Now I'll put in a plug if you don't mind, and even if
Okay.
you do mind, I want to put in the plug anyway. I can just tell you that scientific research now, and research on the nervous system as well, is being, I want to select the right word. The only word that pops into my mind and comes to mind is devastated by the sequestration. And that includes the research on degenerative neural diseases. It includes all research. And I just find it so sad, because it is so necessary, not only for human good, but for our economic good. And what's going on today is I mean, it breaks my heart. It really upsets me very much. But that's the way it is.
Thank you.
Yes, I'd like to get your reaction to this. I'm a teacher, and I taught 8th grade English to my students based on quantum physics. And I used a 12-step yes or no 135-word process I invented that's based on that. And I cut 3 years of the school curriculum down to 3 months, no outside homework. And when my 108th graders took their Iowa test of basic skills, the class average for those 100 kids in English was the 12th grade 6-month level. And I've had people find out about me, and they ask me to tutor international students who come here, and I do that. And I had a Ukrainian student that came 3 years ago, and I got asked to tutor him, so I went to his apartment 2 hours a day, 3 days a week for 3 months, taught him this 12-step process. His textbook was the daily newspaper, because I wanted him on current events where he was going to be living in Ames, Iowa. He did that. His final exam for me was to write me a 200-word sentence in which the only punctuation mark needed was a period at the end, and it had to be grammatically correct, and he did that. And he then told me, he emailed me 3 years ago that the university required him to take their English proficiency exam to see if his English was good enough to teach undergraduate math at Iowa State. He emailed me, said he scored at the highest level possible in that exam. Essentially, he got every question right. And I just, I have been reading a lot of books on brain research and how your nerves work, and it's all being based on quantum physics at that very basic level.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us.
Do you believe in God, or do you believe that's a neurological manifestation?
Next question. I will not
Maybe the
touch that.
experience-
That's a
the
very,
experiences.
very personal question that I will not touch. Right.
Okay.
A very controversial one.
Yeah, I know it's controversial. What about faith experiences that people have, the visions or whatever?
Well, there's a very famous neurologist. He heads the cognitive neuro something lab at University of California, San Diego. This is not a turkey. He's an extremely bright man, extremely deep. He leaves me uneasy because he has all the answers to every single problem that exists in the universe. But he is a very smart guy. And I would just direct you to his book. It's the latest one. I can't remember. Oh my God, I can't remember the name. I can give you his name. And there is a chapter in there on exactly that issue. And he tiptoes around it, but he actually is saying something different. What he's saying, he thinks it's all temporal lobe activity. But you read it, and you have to make up your own mind. Sir.
In regards to the last question about consciousness, is it possible, do you think, that consciousness is like the left side of our brain, and like way back when there was a human race-wide stroke, and that we can recognize it, but we can't see it, and now there's that part of our brain that we don't use anymore? And then like awakenings in people, like that become new people and with new consciousness are reawakenings of that part of the brain. Do you have, like, basically what are your
How
ideas?
am I supposed to know? I mean, scientists have big fights over whether or not animals have consciousness because they can't define consciousness. I don't know. You should see the stuff we study just in hearing, really simple stuff, but we can't figure it out.
At the root of the question, though, do you believe that there's part of our brains that we don't use? Like that's been a common question.
Do we think there's a part of our brain that we don't use?
Yes.
I think that's a bunch of nonsense. What do you mean, don't use it? Just because you're unaware of it. I mean, there's an awful lot of things that go on that now becoming clear that you're unaware of. I mean, I'll give you an example, and it has to be. I mean, one of the things I've always wondered about is how can a major league batter hit a baseball? This thing is coming at him at what, 80, 90, 95 miles an hour? How long does he have to make a decision? He sees it, all right? It's going to be there in what, a half of a second at most? So he's got to see it. He's got to plot its trajectory. It's got to go into his bitty brain. He's got to make that computation. Then he's got to decide, yes, I want to swing. He's got to send all that information down there, and then ultimately his muscles have to execute it. By that time, the ball is in the catcher's hand, and he's throwing it back to the pitcher, all right? How does he and when does he make the decision about swinging? I don't know. But one thing I'm sure of, it's not a conscious decision. He doesn't see it and make a decision and say, yeah. Now, yeah, okay, when the ball is over here, I think I'm going to swing. No. There's all kinds of unconscious things that go on up here, and I don't understand them. I don't know, but they do go on. I don't know how else to answer your question. When my students ask me in the neuroscience class that I teach, well, what about this, what about, they find me saying, and some of them get very upset about this, I don't know. They want answers. They want specific answers that are satisfying so that they can go away with a certain, closure. But I don't have them.
I think unaware versus unused was a.
Pardon me?
Unaware versus unused was a good answer.
Well, that's for sure. Yeah. And there's a lot of things going on that. I mean, one of the things that I tried to get across to you, I should have mentioned it explicitly, is that you would never have, in your wildest dreams, have guessed how the brain works. You couldn't go through just introspection and say, well, I do this, and this, therefore the brain must work this. It doesn't work that way. You're unaware of all these things that are happening in there and the way they work. And that's the best I can tell you.
Thank you.
Okay.
You have shown how injuries might display some connections between one part of the brain and the other, and how that affects the personality with Gage. I wonder, do you have any insight how chemicals might affect personalities, positive or negative? I
Depends
wonder
what kind
maybe
of chemicals.
drugs or
There's some chemicals that make you feel good. Some chemicals that are really
Okay.
bad for you. I don't know. I don't know.
you know.
No. I mean,
Thank you.
obviously, are you asking about drugs?
Well, those would be a chemical, right?
Well, I mean, in some kinds of drugs, they have a good idea how they work, things like cocaine, and they have a good idea where they work. They block the uptake of a thing called dopamine in certain parts of the brain that are associated with reward. Other drugs, like marijuana, they really don't know, and the problem is that all of these drugs have receptors in the brain. They're not made for the drugs. They're made for other things. They're made for naturally occurring chemicals through which neurons communicate with one another. And there's a ubiquitous group of these receptors that bind a chemical like marijuana that's naturally produced. And they influence neuronal activity in very subtle ways. And marijuana binds onto them and activates the channels. And the problem is these things are all over the brain. So how does marijuana work? I don't know. I don't know if anyone really knows. Other drugs, they do know. I mean, some drugs are certainly very poisonous. They'll do one thing or another, either to a metabolic system in your neurons or kill you in some other way. So, again, I don't know how to answer the question.
Thank you. You
exactly.
did. Thank you.
Okay.
So the people who lose the awareness of the left side of their body, can they ever learn to walk or get dressed by themselves, or how would that work?
Well, again, it's my understanding that in some of these people, they make a recovery. All right, some of them a complete recovery, others not. So in most of the stories that I read, in the clinical accounts that I read, they never quite addressed that. Now, Lisa Genova did. And she researched this very, very intensely. Now, you got to remember, this was a novel still. But she never recovered. And she describes what it's like to not be aware of the left side of your body. So, I mean, she does it in many, many, many ways that are very amusing. For example, she'll describe how she uses a walker. And I gather she got this from real patients. And she puts the walker down, and she says she doesn't know what to do because she can't find her left leg. She doesn't know where it is. And she struggles with this for a long time, and she says sometimes she'll find it, and then she'll decide to lift it. And the problem is she'll forget she found it. And all of a sudden she doesn't know where her left leg is anymore, and she'll fall. The descriptions of her getting dressed are almost hilarious. She then describes some more intimate things like going to the bathroom and how difficult that is, as well as having sexual encounters with her husband. I mean, it's a whole thing. She never recovered, no. So I guess there are people who do and those who don't. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.